Our next speaker is Gerrit De Vylder, and he is from the famous University of Leuven in Belgium, and he's going to take us outside Europe. So far, our travels with Thomas More have been confined to Italy or now London, and we move into the Far East with traveling to India, Complementary or Contradicting Utopias.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with a bit of an unusual subject. It concerns also India. I have two focuses in my research. One focus was already economic utopia, and India was another focus in my research. So then I decided to put both together and ask myself to what extent India may have been a utopia in European history, in European thinking. So the argument, actually the question that I'm asking myself is what was the concept of India during the European Renaissance and up to the 18th century? And then what I'm arguing is that to a certain extent, the concept of India could be described as a utopia. So that is the argument. So to proceed, actually I would like to first give an idea of the background, the socio-economic background from the 16th century onwards, which is, I think, essential to understand the concept of India within Europe. This socio-economic background is all about textiles. So you have to imagine that India was a synonym of financial success. Nowhere in the world could investors and traders make so much of money as in India. And this has been there already long before Europeans started discovering, but then discovering between brackets because that's Eurocentric concept. Before the Europeans started discovering the world. It long preceded the existence of the East India companies, in other words. Europe had suffered from a negative trade balance for a very long time, already since antiquity, making itself poorer and India richer. We can go into the details, but that's not the idea. The thing is that originally this trade was in the hands of Indian and Arab traders, and gradually from the 16th century onwards, these traders were increasingly of European origin. But the point is that even though the traders themselves became increasingly of European origin, and this didn't happen from one day to the next, this took about 2 centuries before all the Chinese, the Arab, and the Indian merchants were replaced by European merchants. But the point is that the idea of India actually didn't change. The shift did not change the perception that the comparative advantages were still on India's side. And as a result, India remained for a very long time a symbol or a model for economic success. So India was the place to be. It was kind of also like in the 19th century and the 20th century, America was considered the place where you can make money. Then, at the same time, I would argue that in the history of ideas and of mentality, India was a synonym of fashion. The product concerned that gave India this success were cotton textiles, whatever you call them. In some of the literature, they're called calicos, Indienne, chintz, etc. But it was a kind of revolution due to their comfort. This was unimaginable to Europeans in the 16th century, or already in the Middle Ages, but the availability was very they were very scarce in the Middle Ages, and in the 16th century they became available. But they were washable, they were lightweight, they were hygienic, they were affordable, they had beautiful designs and beautiful colors. It was a kind of magical product that came from India. So compared to the traditional hemp, wool, and linen textiles, which are common to Europe, these ones were soft, and the European ones had a very rough and basic feeling. So to people, to the common man, this was kind of a magical thing that came from the East, from India. And I would argue that it introduced the notice of fashion from the 16th century onwards. A fashion which involved the exotic, whether we call it Ottoman or Indo-Persian. From a European point of view, the difference between Persia and India was never made because the dynasty which was in power in India was a Persian dynasty, the Mughal dynasty. So Indo-Persian was taken as a whole. There was never a clear distinction between Persia and India. I can give you some examples of these. So here, this one you'll find in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, in London, where you can actually feel the difference between the very soft textiles from India compared to the very rough textiles that came in the 16th, 17th century from England itself. And traders were making a fortune, of course. This is another example, Indienne, which you find in a museum in Nantes, in the Château de Duc de Bretagne in Nantes, which reflects the activities of the French East India Company. These Indiennes were straight from India. A wall hanging or bedspread made in Gujarat in the northwest of India for the European market, early 18th century, with silk and cotton. And then a tree of life, which was a very common design, also a hanging made for export, early 18th century from the Musée Guimet in Paris. And then you have the revolution itself. This one is no longer made in India, but it's made in this case, it's made in Nantes, in France, where you see that the first copies are being made of this original Indian product. But the point is that they were so attractive and so much money was involved that there was an incentive of actually starting the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Because the first product of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, in Lancashire, in Manchester, was actually one of these calicoes, one of these Indian cotton textiles. So that brings me to the third claim, that actually India was also the inspiration for production concentration and technologies. We could argue that because of the Indian cotton production, the idea of production concentration and that various tasks were completed under one roof was exported to Europe, and like that, actually, the first calico manufacturers became the first captains of industry, forming the initial core of industrial bourgeoisie. Likewise, its workers coming from textile guilds gradually became the first proletariat. That is the background, so to speak. So Europe was confronted with an exceptional product, and this exceptional product was linked to India. Now, if we come to the history of ideas, if we look into literature and everything, how India was described and conceived, already before the Renaissance, during the Middle Ages, there were the Acts of St. Thomas referring to a kind of Christian India. St. Thomas the Apostle had indeed, at least according to the legend, had indeed been in India to start conversion of India. So India was perceived as a kind of Christian ally, somewhere on the other side of the Islamic world, some concept to link, to be linked to. Interestingly, India was also intermixed, confused with the concept of Ethiopia, and during the Middle Ages we see this kind of confusion continuously in different sources, where India or Ethiopia are being confused with each other. To some extent understandable, because both are linked to actually the early Christianity. And then there's also the interesting story of the Buddha, maybe the most famous Indian that ever lived, the Buddha that also traveled to Europe. Through translations from in Arabic and translations then in Georgian, the Pelaverian, we come to Guy de Gondres' 13th century Old French version of the Christian tale of Balaam and Josaphat, reflecting actually this Indian wisdom. And already then, even though it became a very Catholic, a very pious legend, story, it is about a knight or a prince renouncing the world, discovering that wealth is poverty because of the fear of losing it. Yeah. So that reflects already Vedanta, the old philosophical thinking in India. It also reflects Buddhist thinking already in the Middle Ages. Then if you look at the 16th century, what is important is that the first Europeans who came to India, be they Jesuits or traders, physicians, mariners, etc., but they were all learning Indian languages, and not the other way. No Indian was ever thought of learning one of the European languages to be able to trade with the newcomers or whatever. It's something which cannot be thought of in the context of Latin America. Here you see that Europeans coming to India adjusted to their environment, and they were learning, there's several sources indicating that they were learning the local languages. And the way they describe the country, I'm not going into the details, I'm just giving a few examples. This is a description given by a Portuguese traveler around 1520 of Hampi, which is the capital of the Vijayanagara Empire. It's the best provided city of the world, and so big that it cannot be seen from any spot. Likewise, we have chronicles referring to Asian textual traditions. These textual traditions, so the old scriptures, Hindu scriptures, were often regarded as lost parts of the Old Testament, etc. We have a Jewish, Spanish, Portuguese physician who was the first one to discover Ayurvedic medicine, Indian medicine, which was then much more advanced than anything existing in Europe at the time. Another aristocrat, a Portuguese aristocrat who is concerned with cartography and terrestrial magnetism, clearly stating that he got the information from the Indian crew members. So all these expeditions were done in collaboration with locals. We see that there were two ways actually of describing the Indians. One was by analogy and the other by contrast. But my argument is that actually most of it was by analogy, like comparing Europe to India continuously and considering India as a kind of lost Europe which had to be discovered and which was hiding original values which were lost in Europe. That's basically like Rome was, Varanasi, Puri, Tripati, Kanchipuram, Rameshwaram. These are all the holy cities in India, and they were compared to Rome and Compostela or Jerusalem, etc. For instance, Tripati was described by the Portuguese chronicler Antonio Bocaro as a very large city, which is Rome to them, only for pagodas, which the Gentiles of this whole Orient arranged to have made as large as possible, and whoever does so is regarded as the more devout and powerful. And you see actually the present picture of what still exists in Tripati in southern India. So it was basically compared to, Hinduism was continuously compared to Christianity, that is the point. The holy books in Sanskrit, Sanskrit was mentioned as, they have many books in their Latin. This word doesn't resemble anything, but they probably mean Sanskrit, which contain all that they are to believe and the ceremonies that they are to do. So very interesting is that looking at India was also to compare with antiquity. If we look at a lot of paintings and tapestries which were made in the mid-16th century, like the two sieges of Diu, to give one example, in which the Indians are like the Persians and the Portuguese are like the Greeks. So the comparison here again with ancient Persia, as I just said, the Indo-Persian culture was often seen as one and the same. So if we have a look at the 17th century, then certainly there's something changing. There are a lot of sources that come in with quite often from narrow-minded Jesuits who are only concerned to distribute the true faith, and gradually Hinduism is being considered as something that has nothing to do with Catholicism, but not completely, not completely. One thing I should mention is also that the gift economy came into vogue. The gift economy meaning a European gives some presents to an Indian, and an Indian gives some presents to a European, an exchange economy kind of, to introduce each other. And so like that, a lot of practical knowledge on the Dutch and the English side is growing. A lot of publications on how to trade with India. There's also a new tradition starting in painting. I have a couple of examples here. Here you see, for instance, from Rubens, there are portraits of persons in Indo-Persian and Ottoman styles. The Indo-Persian style becomes quite fashionable. Being dressed in an Indo-Persian way reflects that the fact that you have a lot of money. This is a drawing by Rembrandt. This shows Emperor Shah Jahan, the Mughal emperor in the 17th century. Rembrandt had a whole range of drawings of Mughal emperors. Another painting by Willem Schellings, the Emperor Shah Jahan, again with his 4 sons. And finally, also here a portrait by the famous English engraver Reynold Elstruck of, again, the great Mughal of Eastern India, Shah Jahan. So this interest in India reflects this idea that India contains something very luxurious, that it contains a lot of opportunities to make money, etc. Now then, the 18th century, definitely there is again a big change. This change has to do with the fact that one of the last Mughal emperors in the 18th century was crushed by the Iranian monarch Nadir Shah in the late 1730s. He was crushed by an Iranian, but actually this meant a great opportunity for the British to gradually take over, by a divide and rule system, to take over India gradually, because the central power was increasingly becoming weaker and weaker. And Mughal emperors were considered both weak and cruel. There was no longer did Europeans attempt to copy Mughal and other paintings. Instead, visiting European artists and engravers produced an academic vision of an India of ruins and picturesque landscapes. It became part of Romanticism. It became Orientalism as we know it from the 18th century onwards, and which has had its heydays in the 19th century. However, there were still a lot of exceptions. We have Huguenots and Deists, not going into the details, but they still, in their publications, they still suggested that the Indian religion, so Hinduism, is monotheistic, with a single god at the center, and the comparison even up to the 18th century of Hinduism with Christianity remains. Then we have Jonathan Swift, the famous Irish author with Gulliver Travels. in Gulliver Travels, where he's looking for utopia, he clearly states that these utopian economies that he's discovering, that it's close to Japan, but also close to Fort St. George, which is in present-day Chennai in South India. We have Voltaire, who actually says that he's convinced that everything has come down to us from the banks of the Ganges, astronomy, astrology, metempsychosis, etc., etc. He also argued that it is very important to note that some 2,500 years ago, at the least, Pythagoras went from Samos to the Ganges to learn geometry, but he would certainly not have undertaken such a strange journey, had the reputation of the Brahmin science not being long established in Europe. So Schlegel, again, the same story. He considers that everything came from India. We have also Goethe, who's very fascinated by India, and in his looking for a kind of oneness, this way of looking for oneness in different publications by Goethe, it resembles very much Vedantic thinking. And so actually, the last slides here are to suggest that the story is also the other way. It is also India who is discovering Europe and imagining a Europe which is utopian. But I'm not going into that because that's a little bit too far from the subject here. So we can actually conclude that from the 16th to the 18th century, the concept of India retained utopian qualities, first within the Renaissance framework and later within Romanticism, and that only gradually paternalistic attitudes and superiority complexes started dominating European behavior, still partly within Romanticism. Thank you very much for your attention.